Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Hunak and I am Director of Engagement for SRP, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to another instalment of our lunchtime webinar series in association with AURPO. Today's talk is on the future of contamination and the recovery of agriculture in Chernobyl. Just before we start, we'll go very quickly through the ground rules. So as always, this webinar will be recorded and popped onto our YouTube channel afterwards. You can ask questions at any point throughout the talk. The most liked questions, if you like ones that you see that have already been posted, we'll ask those first at the end of the talk to the speaker. Any that we don't get a chance to answer today will be sent to the presenter afterwards, and then they'll be popped on our website so you can have a look at the answers to those after the talk. You can register for CPD points for your attendance today, so the code and the email address are up there on screen. And as always, please email any feedback to Charlene so we can see what we're doing well at, what you'd like to see any improvements in, and if you've got any ideas for any future webinar topics that you'd like to see. Just a little reminder, if you're not already a member, that you could be getting all of these wonderful benefits that are up there on screen for you. If you pop onto our website, you can get the information on how to join on there. And then just a couple of reminders that we've got issue 7 of our free magazine, Radiation Protection Today. You can access that online if you click on that link. And also that we've got another webinar coming up at the beginning of May on radiation protection for flash radiotherapy. So if you'd like to attend that, then pop onto our website and you can register for your attendance there. And then finally, 2026, the 7th European ERPA Congress is coming to Liverpool, so get that date in your diaries. Without further ado, I will now pass over to Ollie Preedy, who is AURPO Treasurer, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So before I introduce Jim, just another shameful plug that all of the information about joining AURPO is on the AURPO website, and also we have our annual conference in September, which is the 9th and 10th. If you're interested, please go and have a look. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Smith. So Jim is a professor of environmental science at Portsmouth University and is an expert in modelling radioactive pollution in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. He's coordinated 4 multinational projects on the environmental consequences of Chernobyl accident. The Chernobyl accident has regularly worked in the exclusion zone. He is the lead author on a major book on the accident, Chernobyl, Catastrophe and Consequences, and authored key opinion pieces in Nature and Science on the Fukushima accident. He's been a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency expert groups on Chernobyl and Fukushima, and is currently a member of the UK Committee on Medical Aspects of Radiation in the Environment. Jim is currently working on the potential reuse of the radioactively contaminated lands in the Ukraine. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jim, who will give his talk on the future on contamination, recovery of agriculture in Chernobyl. Over to you, Jim.
Well, Jim, your microphone's on mute, I'm afraid. So,
is that? Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, thanks for that introduction and for inviting me to give a seminar. I'm going to do a talk on some of my work at Chernobyl. I've been working on Chernobyl since 1990, when I did my PhD on radioactivity from Chernobyl in the Lake District, and I've sort of been on and off working on it ever since. And I'm going to tell you about a project we started in 2017, which was about recovery of some of the contaminated areas outside the main exclusion zone. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the aftermath and how we've struggled really to recover from Chernobyl, and how particularly in Ukraine there's been an ongoing problem of contaminated land that's classified as contaminated but really shouldn't be. And so that's what I'm going to talk. This project we did with the Ukrainian Institute of Agricultural Radiology and various other, the Ukrainian Hydrometeorological Institute, the University of Salford, CERAD in Norway, and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, So we were looking at reclassifying some of the contaminated agricultural land at Chernobyl outside the main exclusion zone, which remains classified as unfit for use to this day. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with Chernobyl. So that's the picture of the exploded reactor. And Chernobyl, of course, was a explosion within the reactor core. So it wasn't like Fukushima, which was an explosion in the reactor building and escape, a partial meltdown and escape of radioactivity from the core. It was an explosion within the core itself. And you can just see there that the 2,000-ton concrete lid of the reactor, which blown off its hinges, lifted into the air and then set down at an angle by the huge explosion and, of course, the destruction of the reactor building and release of radioactivity around Europe. I've got a map here. We map cesium-137. So cesium-137 has a half-life of about 30 years. So now we're 39 years after Chernobyl now, and there's still sort of probably 40% of the cesium-137 remaining in the environment. So we tend to map cesium rather than some of the shorter-lived nuclides that obviously disappeared in the first weeks and months after the accident. And rather than things like plutonium and americium, which were mainly confined to the exclusion zone and were deposited in much lower quantities. So this is the map of cesium, and we can roughly see. So initially, after the accident, the Soviets drew a circle of radius 30 kilometers. So we sometimes call this the 30-kilometer zone around the plant, and then evacuated that area. Subsequently, that was modified, and the current exclusion zone sort of goes a less regular shape around in Ukraine and across into about half of the exclusion zones in Belarus. And this is the areas that's currently evacuated, and there's no plans to resume agricultural production there. But what I'm talking about today is a second zone, which is outside the main exclusion zone. I just want to talk a little bit about the reaction, because it turns out, perhaps obviously in retrospect, that the social and psychological consequences of the accident have been just as important, if not more important, than the radiological consequences. And I've just picked out some headlines from 1986 around the world. So we saw headlines like "Deadly Toll of Chernobyl." We saw dramatic images of the poor plant operators, firemen who worked on the site that night. So there were about 500 people on site that night. So plant operators, firemen, helicopter pilots who were sent to drop sand and boron and lead onto the burning reactor to try and put out the fire and reduce the neutron flux. And of those 500 people, about 140 of them were diagnosed with acute radiation sickness. So they got a big enough dose that it threatened certainly damaged their health, and in many cases, about 40 cases caused their death. What we also saw in the 1990s particularly was journalists going to hospitals in Kiev, in Ukraine, and Gomel and Mogilov in Belarus, and finding children who had cancer and implying that cancer was caused by Chernobyl. And of course, as radiation protection professionals, we know that it's attributing cancer risk is an awful lot more complicated than that. But nevertheless, the local population had a real problem in understanding what health effects were caused by Chernobyl. And as it turns out, relatively few, not insignificant, but relatively few were caused by Chernobyl. What health effects were caused by Chernobyl, what the radiation risk was, and how to deal with the contamination that was in the landscape around them. On a slightly lighter note, we saw headlines like Austrians told not to panic. And if I was an Austrian and opened my newspaper and it told me not to panic, my first reaction would probably be to panic. Because what we find, of course, after nuclear accidents is that governments and scientists immediately have lost credibility, and particularly in the Soviet system, and the same to an extent here, and certainly in Japan. People have been told for decades that nuclear power was completely safe. And of course, when you tell people that for decades, and then you have the world's worst nuclear accident, an accident that you said was impossible, people lose trust. And this has been an ongoing problem in Ukraine and Belarus, is that people don't trust scientists and governments when actually sometimes we say the right thing and we tell the truth. And the truth is that the risks to people outside of that initial group of 140 people who got acute radiation sickness, all the people outside that, the evacuees, the liquidators, the people living around Chernobyl, all those risks are relatively small. And I'll just briefly, I don't have time to go into all the risk assessments and so on, but briefly to illustrate that, quite a few of my friends are liquidators, so they went into the work in the exclusion zone in the months after the accident, and one of them a few years ago was smoking away, and I said, well, you shouldn't really smoke for your health, and he said, well, I'm going to die of cancer anyway because I was at Chernobyl, and of course he's got an elevated risk. So if we believe the linear no threshold theory, then he's got an extra 0.5 to 1% risk of early death from cancer from the dose that he received. A lifetime smoker, of course, has a risk of early death of about 50% and a 10-year loss of life expectancy, compared to a loss of life expectancy of the liquidator group of about 3 months. And of course, air pollution. So I did a study comparing other environmental pollutants, other environmental impacts on our health with that of Chernobyl and that of the Chernobyl liquidators. And we see a similar, if we live in an air polluted city, we have a similar additional risk of early death from air pollution as the liquidators have from radiation. And of course, we know that these assessments are all uncertain and that there's difficulties in attribution of risk and so on. But in general, the risk even to the liquidators who went to clean up after the accident, that wasn't by any means the biggest health impact on their lives. So in that context, we understand. I was involved in this UN, WHO and IAEA Chernobyl Forum report 20 years after the accident. And one of the conclusions of the health part of that report was that the mental health impact of Chernobyl is the largest public health problem unleashed by the accident to date. And I think it's not to minimize the elevated risk of cancer, and it's not to minimize the known observed thyroid cancers that we saw after Chernobyl, but it does emphasize the importance of the social and economic impacts of the accident, and that's really partly what I want to talk about today. So our project, we were looking at various things, but we were mainly looking at the reclassification of contaminated land in what we call the second zone, or the zone of unconditional resettlement. So here's the main, so this is Ukraine, Belarus is up here. This is the main exclusion zone, which remains evacuated, and there aren't currently plans to re-inhabit that or reuse it for agricultural land, although in many parts you could, but it's pretty, at least for the coming decades, it's probably going to remain as a nature reserve. What we're looking at is the kind of semi-abandoned area. It's called the zone of unconditional resettlement because it was supposed to be resettled. In other words, people were supposed to be evacuated, but they weren't fully evacuated, and many people chose to stay. So we're working in a town. This is in Ukrainian, but it says Narodichi. So this is Narodichi. In Narodichi, before the accident, there were 30,000 inhabitants, and now there are about 10, 11,000 of people who either refused to move or didn't have the opportunity to move. And they're living, there's a school, there's shops, and it appears to be a fairly normal, if very poor town, but there's no official use of agricultural land allowed in that region. So all these orange regions, in theory, and not necessarily in practice, because there's lots of unofficial use of agricultural land, but in theory, all these orange areas, which extends to about 2,000 square kilometers in Ukraine, all these orange areas are officially not usable for agriculture. So we were working with our Ukrainian colleagues to try and do the science to try and begin to change that. So in Narodichi, we did a pilot study. We did various consultations with the local people and telling them what we were doing and what we were planning. We essentially wanted to develop a protocol to say we can prove that this land is okay or not, as the case may be, but we suspected, and I think we were right, that most of the region around Narodichi could safely be used to grow crops again. One of the things we did was to choose a field plot in a village called Mezheliska. So we chose a 100-hectare field, and we characterized it for the radioactive contamination and then modeled what the doses from that contamination would be. So here's our field, and we used a simple method of using a dose rate meter to measure dose rates across the field, and we took soil samples to determine the cesium and strontium levels in the soil, and we could relate what we saw on the dose rate meter to the cesium contamination, and that allowed us to develop a simple method to produce a quick map of a field based just on the external dose rate. So this is our field. This is our dose rate survey, and we see the levels. So the dose rate went between about 0.14 and about 0.28 microsieverts per hour. We can see this edge of the field is more contaminated. And then we correlated what we saw on the dose rate meter with what we'd measured in the soil at certain points in the field, and that allowed us to do two things. One, it allowed us to extrapolate our soil contamination based on the dose rate, and it also allowed us to develop a method to quickly do this for other fields in the future, just based on the dose rate survey meter, and that takes about a day to characterize a 100-hectare field using a dose rate survey meter. This is what we got by kriging for the contamination density. So we can see that the contamination density, sorry, this is again in Ukrainian script, but it's kilobecquerel. It's quite easy to see. It's kilobecquerels per square meter. And we see again, this edge of the field has up to sort of 400 kilobecquerels per square meter. And then over here, we're sort of down 100, 150 kilobecquerels per square meter. And what did that allow us to do? Well, that allowed us first to compare with the field with what the criteria for contamination density in Ukraine is. And we could confidently say, so here's our mean cesium for the field. This is our mean strontium for the field, and that had to be based on soil sample measurements, because you can't obviously measure strontium by gamma analysis. But it gave us a strontium to cesium ratio, which we could use for other fields in the future. So what did it show? It said that quite confidently the cesium contamination was not in the zone 2. It was below 555 kilobecquerels per square metre. It was in zone 3, which has much fewer restrictions on use of agricultural land. We also looked at transfer to crops, and so this is a little bit complicated, this table, but this shows for different crops, based on our soil measurements and based on concentration ratios, soil to plant concentration ratios of radioactivity in that region, we could work out, so this CP0 is the exceedance level, so that's the 60 becquerels per kilogram is the limit in Ukraine for potatoes. It's actually quite a conservative limit. In Europe, the import limit for foodstuffs for cesium is 1,250 becquerels per kilogram. But in Ukraine, the limits are more restrictive, partly because more people are getting radioactivity from more different sources than they are in Europe. So that's the limit. This is the mean expected radiocesium in crops, and this is a calculation which is the probability of exceeding that that permissible level, which is very low for potatoes. So it shows us same for strontium. That's the permissible level for strontium. That's what we predicted to be in the crops. So this method allows us to determine, based on a dose rate survey of a field, we can work out the strontium from the cesium strontium ratio from that for that region. We know that the plutonium americium is not significant, so it allows us, just based on a 1-day dose rate survey of a field, we can calculate whether the field can be used and which crops can be safely grown there with a high probability. We also looked at doses to farmers and farm workers based on a Monte Carlo risk assessment. So we looked at the uncertainty in terms of time spent on the farm, inhalation of radioactivity from agricultural activities like ploughing, like sorting seeds, like drying seeds, skin dose, and dose to reproductive organs, and so we calculated all those were very small, and I'll just show you our calculated external and inhalation doses. So this is the variation in additional external dose from 137CS. So it's around sort of between 10 and 50 microsieverts per year, and that compares, this is the approximate range of worldwide external dose rates from terrestrial gamma emitters and cosmic radiation. So this is obviously at high altitudes and areas of high external natural radiation, but we can see that the additional dose that the farm worker is getting is significantly below the 1 millisievert per year recommendation, and it's significantly below what we see from natural radiation external doses. This is the inhalation dose, very, very minor, between less than 1 microsievert per year. And of course, that's negligible compared to the sort of range in what we see worldwide from natural alpha emitters, so radon, polonium isotopes, and that should be lead-210. I think that should be Pb-210. But we can see that the inhalation dose is comfortably below that limit. So the doses to workers were insignificant, and the crops could be grown based on the permissible levels in Ukraine. But that's not the end of the story. So we now have a method which allows us to say this field is okay or not for use of certain crops. The big problem that we've come up against, and some of our Ukrainian colleagues have been up against for many years, is that there's very complex political and social aspects to the zoning of land, because people, and rightly or wrongly, I would say wrongly, people were given compensation after Chernobyl, not based on the radiation detriment to their health, or even really based on the radiation risk, but based on where they lived. So if you, in Ukraine, if you lived in an area which was classified as Zone 2, you got a significant uplift in benefits. So many people in this area are unemployed, partly because not enough of the agricultural land is being used, but many people are unemployed, and many people live on benefits. And by living in an area of a certain contamination, you get extra benefits. And some of these, particularly for pensioners, they're small by our standards, but by Ukrainian standards, it makes a difference to people's lives. And that means people are really worried about, if the land is reclassified, if the zone is reclassified, are they going to lose their compensation? And of course, we might say, well, that is not fair that they get compensation, because there's no really significant health detriment. But that compensation is important to them. And the politicians representing those areas know that an easy vote is to say, we're going to keep your compensation. And it's been politically very, very difficult, even though we can say, and the Ukrainian scientists have been saying for a long time, that this land can be used again. So all these questions of who's going to benefit from the agricultural land, indeed who owns it, because this land was abandoned before Ukraine became independent. All these questions are incredibly complicated, and much more complicated than our scientific question of how to declassify the land. And so this is ongoing, and this is something our colleagues in Ukraine and we are still working on, is how to persuade politicians to rezone the land while still keeping the local population content that they're seeing the benefit from that rezoning. I'm just going to show you a little bit about our Chernobyl distillate alcohol project. So part of probably the most important part of my work over the last, how many years I've been studied, 35 years I've been studying Chernobyl. The most important part is communication. And it's the most difficult part as well, because as we know, and I'm sure you're all familiar, is that it's really hard to communicate radiation risks and to explain to people what the real risks are and help them understand those risks. So our distillate alcohol, or our vodka project, as we sometimes call it, came about because we wanted to demonstrate that something could be grown in these lands. And so we did a project actually near the town of Chernobyl, so just south of Chernobyl town in the main exclusion zone. And first of all, we were looking at the transfer to crops 30 odd years after the accident. And so we ploughed up, or our Ukrainian friends ploughed up some land just near Chernobyl town, and we planted barley and rye and wheat to look at the soil to plant transfer 35 years after the accident. And we found that the cesium was actually below the Ukrainian permitted limit, but the strontium was just slightly above that limit. And of course, that limit's very conservative. So I would have been happy to make bread from the grain and eat it. But what we wanted to do was to make a product that we could say was totally free of Chernobyl radioactivity. So we fermented the grain and then distilled it to produce a kind of schnapps. And we found that we couldn't see any kind of obviously, really, but we couldn't see any Chernobyl radioactivity in the distillate, in the vodka that we produced. There was, of course, carbon-14, because there's carbon-14 in everything that's got carbon in it, or modern carbon anyway. But we couldn't see any Chernobyl. We couldn't see any cesium, strontium, plutonium, americium, and so we decided to set up a social enterprise to start marketing the atomic spirits. We set up the Chernobyl Spirit Community Interest Company, and the aim was to produce spirits partly as a public communication exercise to show that, you know, after this terrible accident, we could still produce stuff from that exclusion zone, but partly to try and support the local community a bit. So we're working with a distillery in Ukraine, and they go around and take an apple harvest in autumn, buy apples from local people, and that could be abandoned orchards in the zone 2 around Narodici. It could be people's gardens where they go and buy the apples from people. So it puts a little bit of money back into the community, and then so we market it and sell it in the UK mainly, but we now have a partnership with the Whiskey Barrel, who's a Scottish whiskey online vendor, and they can sell in the United States. So they buy it off us and sell it over in the US. And so far we've sold about sort of 7,000 bottles and donated about 35,000 quid to support Ukraine. And we're particularly aiming our donations at those areas that were affected by the accident. And so that's the project. One thing we've done, we do anonymous donations to the high school in Narodici because we don't want to encourage alcoholism. Alcoholism is a much bigger problem than radiation in those affected areas of Ukraine. But we bought them new furniture. The school hadn't had new furniture since the Soviet period, so we bought them some new furniture, supported their Christmas party, which had been cancelled because of the war in Ukraine. And so we're trying to put a bit back into the community. And I think partly it's not just about communication, but it's about establishing there that people can trust us, that we do genuinely want to make life better for that community. And that gives us more, as scientists, more credibility in what we say about the radiation risk. So that's my talk, really. So this is the summary. So the radiation protection science is very clear that areas outside the main exclusion zone, and indeed probably most of the main exclusion zone itself, are very low risk in terms of dose. Crops can be grown safely in most of, and possibly all of, those areas outside the main exclusion zone. The politics is complicated. And the communication is complicated. And one thing that we can do as scientists is produce and follow a clear protocol to demonstrate to people that the land can be used safely. But the key difficulty, particularly at the moment in Ukraine, is ensuring that local people get some benefit from the reclassification and don't just lose the compensations that have become important to their living standards. That's my talk finished. If you want more information, there's some links there. We've hopefully got a paper coming out in Journal of Environmental Radioactivity on our protocol and reclassification of land coming out in the next couple of months, hopefully. If you want to buy any of our product, you can go to our website, www.atomicvodka.com, and put in an order if you're interested. It's got great reviews. So this is a thing called Sorted Food, which I didn't know about. It's a YouTube thing, and they do a tasting of our atomic spirits, and so you can have a look at that and see what they think. But they liked it. They liked it. Okay, I think that's my talk finished.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim.